Okay, this video is going to be on section 2, conformity and obedience. And before we go any farther, I want you to look again at the actual assignment that is in Google Classroom. And if you look at those instructions, you will see there were 2 other videos that you were supposed to watch before this one. There's a video on the Asch conformity experiment, and then there's a video on the Milgram experiment. If you haven't watched those, stop this video right now and go and watch those videos. It's important that you watch those videos first before you get into this summary. All right. So, this chapter we're into is called Social Psychology, and in many ways is part of one of the most fascinating components of psychology because it talks about this one in particular, conformity. Why do we act like other people? The story starts out where the chapter more or less starts out page 556. I know that in 555 we talk about this short story by James Thurber. I want to take a look at what it says on 556 in the group pressure to conform. Very top of the text. Have you ever come home and surprised your parents by wearing the latest fad in clothing, and the conversation that followed could be along the lines of, how do you go around looking like that? And then you respond with, but everyone dresses like this. If you've experienced this sort of thing, my bet is that you were probably in middle school, because that is when developmentally we tend to be very, very interested in learning to conform, to be like others in the group. If you look at the definition, conformity, acting in accord with group norms or customs. And we've talked about this before. When you're part of a group, part of a clique, there are certain customs, there are certain norms that have to be followed. But this is a fascinating element of psychology. How far will we go to conform? Now, if you watch the Asch video, you saw that people, over 75% of people are willing to admit that the wrong line is the match for the first line if the majority of people before you are going along, are saying that the wrong line is actually the correct match. 75% of people are willing to, at least publicly, conform their behavior to the expectations of the other. Now note, this is different. They're publicly willing to say this, but this isn't necessarily an illustration of what they actually believe, although some people actually will. Sometimes even a majority. They will actually alter their beliefs to meet the demands of the group. And just really briefly, I want you to look at figure 1910. This is a picture from the original Asch experiments in the 50s. Take a look at that right-hand picture. The look on that guy's face tells you everything. He is looking at what other people are saying, and his face is saying, are you out of your mind? WTH. What the heck is going on here? How can these people be doing this? And when we're in a group situation, and we see this sort of thing go on, we start to question. We start to question not only what other people are doing, but we also, and here's the key, we actually start to question ourselves. It's like, am I actually not seeing this right? Is there something wrong with me? Well, the majority are saying this. And since the majority are saying this, a lot of times we may end up saying, well, then I must be wrong. And as a result, they even actually will alter their beliefs. And this is a fascinating thing that we see over and over in psychology, and can sometimes help explain some behaviors that we otherwise might not see. Now, if you're looking at why people conform, take a look at page 557. It seems it's hardest to stand alone. Researchers have shown that under some conditions, a minority view can come to win over the larger group. So it is conceivable that not like the Asch experiment, which was constructed, but in an actual situation where a majority tend to be going a particular direction, sometimes a minority voice speaks up and says, well, wait a minute, this isn't right. Sometimes that can get others, the majority, to actually stop and think, and then they may reevaluate their position. One of the great sorrows for me this year is I was going to do the play 12 Angry Women, or 12 Angry Men, it doesn't really matter, what the gender is, and it's really a story of this sort of thing and how we have a majority view, and there seems to be almost full conformity, but then there's a minority view that gets presented, and it actually ends up winning over the majority. If you go on to the next paragraph, in Asch's experiment, participants conformed. They responded to match the other group's members' responses, yet, and this is what I mentioned earlier, they might not have changed their beliefs. This contrast between public behavior and private belief often characterizes the concept of compliance. Compliance occurs when we respond to the request of another person without necessarily changing our beliefs. And you can see this sort of thing going on all the time, sometimes even in national affairs. In some senses, it's going on right now. Most everyone is in compliance with the lockdown orders, but if you talk to people, you will find a substantial minority. It's still a minority based on polling data, although I'm going to get back to that in a minute. There's a substantial minority that, well, I don't really believe this, but because everyone else is doing it, I am pretty much gonna comply. Now, there's also an element of this when it comes to polling data. Sometimes when people take polls, they will tell the pollster what it is that they think the pollster wants to hear. It is interesting. If you go back and examine the 2016 election, I know you guys were a little bit younger and probably weren't paying attention to it, but does anyone, if you happen to recall, the polls all said on election eve that Hillary Clinton was a surefire winner. There was no question about it. The only polling company that gave Donald Trump any chance to win was a guy by the name of Nate Silver, who runs an outfit called 538, and he does some polling. He gave Trump a 30% chance of winning. Far and away, that was the largest predictor in favor of Trump, and yet he would have said 70% likely that Hillary is going to win. Yet we all know what happened. One of the theories that's been tossed around that suggests this sort of thing is that the polling data was skewed because when you asked people who they were going to vote for, there were a lot of people who probably felt, well, I would like to vote for Trump, but I can't say that. If I say that, I'm going to get ridiculed. Now, a pollster's not actually going to ridicule anyone. But back in 2016, and even now, if you come out in public and say, yeah, I'm totally in favor of Trump, a lot of people are going to ridicule you. Not necessarily so much here in Tri-Cities, but boy, if you're in Seattle, that's definitely the case. And so you learn not to say it in public. You comply in public, but your private belief, that doesn't change. So keep that in mind. Conformity in public doesn't necessarily mean that a person has changed their beliefs. They talk about a method of gaining compliance, methods of gaining compliance, getting people to agree. Concept called the foot in the door technique. This is typically most described with regards to sales. A door-to-door salesman comes in, knocks on your door, says he wants to sell you some knives or wants to sell you a vacuum or whatever. And you and your parents, you're not interested in buying, not at all. And the salesman said, hey, wait, just let me come in and talk to you about it. You're under no obligation. That's a classic phrase. You're under no obligation, but let me in and we can talk about it. And you say, well, okay, because you're a nice person. You don't want to slam the door on their face. So you let them in, and then once you've let them in, that literally is the first step towards compliance, because now you don't want to say no to the guy. Whereas if you'd simply said no at the door and, however politely, shut the door in his face, that would have been the end of it. If you take a look at page 558, you'll look at several factors that increase conforming behavior in people. I'm going to let you go through that. Now, compliance is more or less the verbal assent to saying that something is true, even though deep down you may not necessarily believe it. Now, this is different than obedience. If you look at the definition on 558, a change in attitude or behavior brought about by social pressure to comply with people perceived to be authorities. This is a little bit different than compliance. Okay, technically compliance and obedience look exactly the same. But compliance says on the surface you're obeying, whereas your beliefs may not have changed. Obedience is different. Obedience is you've got an authority telling you something is true, or you must do this, and you go, okay, I guess I have to do that. It's a little bit different. It's a little bit different than compliance. Now, this is another point where I have to stop and say I gave you two videos to watch, the Asch experiment and the Milgram experiment. Before you watch this video, if you haven't watched the Milgram experiment, you need to stop this right now and you need to go watch that video, and then we'll come back and discuss this. Now, assuming everyone has done that, we go back and explore this. Having watched that Milgram video, there's not a heck of a lot more for me to say, save for this. And we've talked about this in class. And this study has actually been replicated. When you run this sort of study, between 70 and 80% of participants, sometimes even with a Swarthmore study that occurred just in the 90s, you can get up to 90% obedience, where the person will continue to hit the button thinking they're giving a lethal shock to someone. Now remember, you're talking sometimes shocks that are upwards of 400 volts. Dryer circuits and oven circuits are 220 volts. They will knock you against the wall and potentially stop your heart. 400 volts, that's a lethal dose of electricity. And so often the test subjects, because there was an authority telling them what to do, they said, okay, points on you. I guess we're going to have to go ahead and do it. Now, the last element with regards to conformity that's talked about here is the Stanford Prison Experiment. There are multiple videos out there. I am not going to obligate you specifically to watch them because there are issues. There are issues with the Milgram experiment. There are big issues with the Stanford Prison Experiment. Never mentioning the fact there are gigantic ethical issues surrounding it, but a lot of the findings ended up having to be called into question because Zimbardo, who ran the Stanford Prison Experiment, there's been a lot of question as to whether things actually turned out as he reported. So the conclusions that the Stanford Prison Experiment brought up, which says that given a particular role that you are obligated to fulfill, somewhat similar to the Milgram experiment, okay, you are eventually going to take on the behaviors that will allow you to execute that job, even if they're diametrically opposed to who and what you were beforehand. Again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because I've read sufficient research that calls into question the validity of the Stanford Prison Experiment. And like the Milgram experiment, ethically, we can't really run the thing over again. But that's just a very, very, very brief summary of conformity. I will tell you this is one of the more fascinating elements of psychology, and if I were to go back and study again, if I weren't doing neuropsych, this is probably where I'd get into looking at things because there is definitely some fascinating stuff to be found there. And then you've got one more video to watch on section 3, and then you'll be all done here. See ya.